I was only attempting to enjoy a pleasant meal when the gunmen came charging into the shopping center, at which I chose to spend the afternoon. It wasn't the busiest of establishments, which was why it had become my favorite location for gathering the necessities I could find there. Much more bustling places were not to my particular liking, but I could often track down much of what I needed in this place. No, I was certain it was only a matter of time until it would close its doors for good. Perhaps it was not the best location for such an emporium. Maybe the convenience of online shopping will eventually eliminate the need for such places altogether, but I still had a fondness for them. Over the course of the last year, almost a third of the shops this building housed moved on, but there was still a decent variety that remained, and I do enjoy the experience of the food court. An assembly of multiple restaurants and cafes all in one convenient area. I could pick and choose entries from each, had I the desire to, and I do enjoy diversity in my chosen meals. When the group of heavily armed and armored individuals came flooding in, firing their weapons at the ceiling to instill as much fear as they could, the meager crowd whose company I shared instantly panicked and screamed out in terror. Some attempted to flee, and, though the apparently well-trained individuals did not fire on them, they did thrust the butts of their guns against heads and guts as some made their attempt to escape this madness. My only concern was enjoying my delicious food, so I remained at my table while our heavily armed hosts rounded up those who made the efforts to leave. Over the course of maybe 20 minutes, more members of the militant throng came strolling into the area with groups of huddled and terrified citizens of the city. It would seem that they had been guarding the exits while their associates spread the initial wave of panic-inducing fear. Still, they had not hurt anyone, outside of some heavy bruising and the occasional broken nose, but nothing fatal. This fact alone made me feel quite hopeful about the outcome of this situation. Perhaps I would not have to get involved after all. That could have been very wishful thinking, but I wanted nothing more than a normal and carefree life. Surely I had earned that right. I could not make out any of the faces of our captors, as they were all wearing woolen masks and helmets upon their heads. There were 14 of them in all, each dressed in black fatigues and what appeared to be some type of body armor. They all had pistols on their hips, long knives strapped to their legs, and automatic rifles of some variety in their hands. I never familiarized myself with the names or types of the many guns I have seen over the years. I remember when the most complex manner of weapon I would witness was a simple flintlock, but it has been a long time since then, and firearms have evolved considerably over time. Though I continued leisurely enjoying my second fried chicken sandwich while the apparent leader of this group bellowed his demands into a cellular device, I did feel my brow crease when I laid eyes on a small group of children towards the back of the room. They looked to have been some sort of club. All 6 of them wore the same style of tan-colored shirts, as did the 2 adults who were with them. They were unlikely all of the same family, as multiple races were represented throughout the small group. But a couple of them did favor the male and female who watched over them. I hated seeing the young ones filled with such fear and dread, but the last time I took it upon myself to intervene in such things, it brought me a good deal of trouble between some of my peers and I. And that's when I chose to part ways with my kind, to remain on the surface and attempt to lead a normal life. It was going so well, too. The man who screamed into the device appeared to be becoming rather infuriated, causing a great deal more panicked wails to erupt through the room. There were around 46 hostages all gathered in this open room. Some sat on chairs, while others huddled together on the floor or stood by the rear wall, but all wore the same expressions of sheer terror. Had I the same weakness to gunfire, I would likely be showing the same symptoms of fear, but I still had at least half of my carbonated fountain drink to keep me content for the time being. I greatly craved another of the magnificent sandwiches I had only just consumed. But alas, the employees of the food stands, as well as those of the remaining shops, were grouped together with the rest of us at this current time. The gunmen had all gathered together after their leader became enraged, and threw his device against a nearby wall, shattering it into slivers of plastic and electrical components. I could only assume that negotiations had come to something of a standstill, forcing the rather tall and bulky man to become quite agitated. As a handful of the members of his battalion attempted to calm him, 2 others went around the room, gathering a few of the hostages to form a line before the rest of us. Within moments, the large man received another device from one of his associates to scream his demands into it once more. His rage only escalated, ultimately leading him to draw and fire his pistol into the heads of the 2 of those who stood in the row at the head of the room. An elderly man and woman instantly fell to the floor after the sounds of the weapon discharging echoed through the room, inspiring a chorus of louder and more terrified screams from the other hostages whose company I shared. I found my back tensing up as the bloodlust began to cause my mouth to water in a way I had not felt since that Halloween led me to walk away from my people. My skin began to tremble, and I feared I would not be able to maintain the mask I wore to blend in with those of the surface world. I knew that if more blood was shed, I would have little choice but to intervene, but I know all too well the wrath of the elders should I risk such a public exposure again. Of course, if these gunmen laid one hand on the children, I would not continue to sit idly by to watch them come to any harm. Though it angered me greatly to witness the elderly couple lose their lives for whatever cause these men fought for, I rarely found the need to step in for the sake of adults. Since my outlook on humanity changed so many years ago, I do not like to see innocent lives lost, but I cannot halt all of the violence that such men bring. Well, there was even a time I would have likely not given a second thought before tearing through the flesh of just about anyone in this room. But that is not who I am anymore. Perhaps this could still come to something of a peaceful resolution. I cannot deny things were so much simpler if I followed the old ways. The man's rage-fueled rant finally came to a close, and he returned to a much calmer tone as he spoke into the borrowed device. I felt the tension in my shoulders release, and I could tell that the large man's associates breathed their own sighs of relief. Clearly not every member of this militant throng were of the same mindset as their leader. I couldn't help but wonder if they even knew what they were in for when they took up arms this day. I could not fathom what they actually hoped to achieve through these actions, but I never did understand the motivations of such people. Yes, I have killed more people over the centuries than I could even begin to count, but I had my reasons. I would not shed blood unless I had cause to do so. I cannot say that I thought highly of humanity back then, but I would not go out of my way to hurt anyone. When the hunger set in, of course, I would not think twice. When the hordes of fearful individuals would wage an attack on me or my kind, I would not hold back either, but that was in defense of myself and my own. Perhaps I could have spared the lives of those who threatened us, but it felt more efficient to make sure they could never make a second attempt. Something like the situation I found myself in now. However, this I could not rationalize. The row of my fellow hostages were permitted to take a seat on the floor, as they apparently had no need of further examples just yet. They would not release them to rejoin the others, but they appeared to relax more when allowed to rest their trembling legs. 2 of the masked men dragged the elderly couple away, though no effort was made to address the white streak of blood that trailed behind them. I could not deny it was a sight that made me feel somewhat ravenous. But I thankfully have so much more willpower than I used to. Everyone seemed to be growing more at ease while I pulled the last of my cold beverage through a plastic straw. It was disappointing to be unable to receive a refill, but I could only hope this ordeal would be over soon. Just as I was beginning to feel secure in the knowledge that the negotiations between those who held us at gunpoint and whoever they were communicating with had reached an accord, I once more felt my neck stiffen. Several of the armed men went rushing down the twin corridors that led away from the food court in opposing directions, towards the doorways which led into and out of this building. There were murmurs throughout the crowd, both the one I shared and those who held us in place. Without a word, the large man in charge directed a couple of his lackeys to snatch up another two of those held at the front of the room. They grabbed them by the hair and dragged them in the direction of those who had only just fled the room, with their leader in pursuit. Those who stayed behind trained their weapons on us in no particular order. I saw this as a little more than a demand for us to stay put, which was not something I felt they had to fear. Nobody showed any intention of intervening in their plans, whatever they may have been. Unfortunately, I was finding my own conviction to remain in place waning significantly. Not only had I grown almost insufferably bored by this experience, but I was starting to believe that it was only a matter of time before they saw fit to fire their weapons at the rest of us. When another series of gunshots reverberated against the walls of the hallway that led to the exit, I had little doubt that the two they dragged in that direction had lost their lives as the elderly couple had. This time, however, there were more shots fired from outside this building. The armed men who remained were having harried conversations with those who had left through their communication devices. There was an abundance of swearing and panicked-sounding pleas. It stood to reason that the authorities had gathered outside of the shopping center, putting these men on the defensive for the time being. When our jailers patched up the wounds of their associates, the whimpers and cries of the crowd began to settle down. As the room fell somewhat silent, I gave a heavy sigh with the knowledge this would not be coming to an end anytime soon. Unfortunately, this exaggerated action led to a few of my neighbors to glance in my direction. Some just wore something of an annoyed expression, but a couple of the children in the back of the room screamed after paying attention to me for the first time. I had hoped I could remain unnoticed by the young ones. For the most part, I remained quiet, while they had kept their heads buried in hopes of not being dragged out to the line of potential examples to prove the gunmen's resolve. Why did I have to wait until everything was silent to allow my contempt for this ordeal to pass through my lips? Of course, when one child saw behind my mask, it did not take long for the rest of them to look deeper. The adults who took care of the little ones attempted to calm them, but it was proving difficult as all they could see was a beast among the monsters who held us in place. If nothing else, at least the adults could not make out what I really was just yet, though if they carried on much longer, I did not know if I could maintain my focus to keep my veil in place. To make matters worse, the panicked screams of the children caught the attention of the gunmen. They were gesturing in my direction while begging me to spare their lives. Had I only been able to communicate with them freely, I was sure I could have convinced them that I would never bring them harm, but all they could see was my true physicality at the time, something that would strike fear into the bravest of men. They could not know my true nature based on that much. As two of the armed men approached a group of young ones, aiming their weapons at them, I had an inspiration. While the men raged at the children how they would blow them away should they fail to cease their screams, I decided to give them a bit of a performance. I began to wail and cry out in my best attempt at a panicked man-child while I leapt from my seat and ran in the direction of the exit. The gunmen turned their attention to the terrified, slim-statured adult male that they saw attempting to flee and away from the young ones. I turned around just in time to receive the wealth of bullets they fired into my body, making sure to fall to the floor face down, as to not allow them to witness my wounds closing back shut. I could only hope this would satisfy the fearful children that the monster had been dealt with, while also feeding our little captor's thirst for violence. It is true that it left me in quite the uncomfortable position, with my nose pressed flat against the firm floor, but within moments the two men pulled my body from the room to take my place beside other corpses in one of the vacant stores they were using for body storage. I did have to provide them some subtle assistance with this, as I could not allow them to feel the true weight of my body, which far exceeded that of the slender male I was playing the part of. But their assumption that I was deceased led them to pay little attention to my fingers and toes nudging myself across the floor. Once I was positioned alongside the handful of their previous victims, the men left the room I now occupied. Being finally separated from both groups, I could dispel my veil for a moment. Though I had grown quite accomplished at my natural powers of illusion, I could still only maintain it for so long before it took almost unbearable effort. I planned to take this time to rest up for a while, hopeful that I would be left alone for long enough to fully recuperate my energy. I hoped the children would remain safe, now they had only the armed individuals to fear. But it did make me quite nervous, being unable to keep an eye on things for a time. Still, I would need every ounce of my power should things get even further out of hand, so best to rest up for a while, as I was able to do so. While I sat alone for the time, aside my fellow corpses, I had found myself pondering on why such a battle had erupted between those who held us hostage and the others outside. Though I wasn't particularly well versed in the laws of this land, the television programs and films I have viewed as of late led me to believe that the authorities would not open fire when hostages are involved. Perhaps it was our captors who made those initial shots, forcing the law enforcers to defend themselves. Of course, these were only passing whimsies. I did not much care for the troubles between men, especially with my seeking a more peaceful existence. Well, I did enjoy immersing myself in the picture shows and televised images, though. I only recently began indulging in such methods of entertainment, but I only sought out new ways of blending in at first. And the more I viewed, the more I became engrossed in the stories that would play out before my eyes. I cannot deny that if I were to take a stand against these terrorists, I would potentially play it out as an elaborate action sequence with its own gripping, orchestral score in the back of my mind. I would, of course, be the brave and noble hero in this instance, laying my life on the line to protect the innocent against a formidable foe. It is true that I were to truly unleash on these men, they would be no more formidable than a swarm of insects to me. But the movie would not necessarily reflect this aspect of things. For a moment, I considered taking this opportunity to flee this place. With nobody watching over me, it would take me little effort to break free without exposing myself to anyone. My secret would be safe, and the elders would have no reason to seek retribution for my actions. But I could not leave the children to potentially fall victim to whatever these men had planned. I would go through a good deal of inner debating while allowing my body the rest it craved. It was not our place to meddle in the affairs of humankind, but I could not bear the burden on my conscience should the little ones come to any harm, when I could have prevented it. As I sat in place, pondering over the many sides of this equation, I grew aware of the sounds of another commotion brewing outside these doors. Fortunately, this opportunity to relax had allowed me more than enough time to recuperate. That and a little borrowed blood from my current roommates. Though I truly enjoyed the meal I had acquired from the food stands, it did not quite provide the same nutrients my body craved as a fresh corpse could. I allowed my body to take a vaporous form, leaving my bloody clothes behind. I soared into the ventilation system to remain hidden from prying eyes. I considered solidifying when I reached the shaft above the food court, but I was unsure if this thin, metal tunnel could fully withstand my weight, or even if I would fully fit. So, I remained in my misty form as I watched on from above to be sure I would not be discovered. As I peered through the grated strips of metal with my gaseous eyes, I saw that my fears may be coming to life. The children screamed out while their guardians attempted to fight away the three men as they pulled them from the floor. Fortunately, they did not make an example of the adults, though they did forcibly render them unconscious. A few of the other hostages made half-hearted attempts to stop the men from dragging the little ones to the front of the room, beside the handful who remained in a row, but their efforts were cut short when the barrel of a gun was trained on them. Even with my body consisting of a little more than smoke, I could still feel the trembling course through me as I watched the small group of children being led to the large man in charge. He was shouting into his device again, threatening to take the lives of the children to those who'd listen on the other end of the line. The man demanded that the little ones call out into the device he held outstretched towards them, but every one of them closed their mouths and ceased their terrified whimpers. I found myself impressed by the conviction of these little ones, who would not allow this bully the attention he desired. The moment of joy I felt watching these 6 tiny people show such bravery against those who towered above them quickly turned to rage when the leader slapped a little girl across the face. With that, another 3 of the children attempted to fight back, while the remaining 2 checked on the one who was now weeping on the floor with her face beginning to inflame. It took very little effort for the gunmen to control the little ones, but they showed far more brutality than was necessary. They actually swung their punches as hard as they would to an adult opponent. A couple of the children lost consciousness when the tightly balled fists made contact with their little jaws. They even kicked at the 3 who huddled on the ground, showing absolutely no threat. I could feel the heat course through every fragment of my being. It took all of the self-control I had not to charge downwards and tear each and every one of the armed men to shreds before they could so much as even utter a single word. I could not risk getting them reason to fire on the little ones, should my actions not be quick enough. So, I reluctantly held my position. Once the men had the situation back under their control, they stood the children upright, even those who were no longer awake. They just held them in place, while their leader drew his pistol and trained it on the little girl who had rebelled against his hand with her face. She still refused to speak up, but the sounds of the previous skirmish had given him exactly what he desired. He made an oath to those on the other end of the phone that he would not hesitate to put a bullet into each and every one of the children should he not be granted his desire. I desperately hoped that these were only idle threats, but when he cocked his pistol and forced the barrel against the little pigtail girl's head with intent etched onto his face, I knew I could not allow this to go any further. If I was quick enough, maybe I could keep myself concealed. I swiftly soared back through the ventilation shaft, knowing that I could not attack from above, as that would make my presence far too obvious, even as little more than a dense fog. I flew back into the room which held the fallen victims, and out into the hallway which led to the food court. The man was still shouting into his receiver, maintaining his aimed weapon at the little girl's head. His hand was visibly trembling as he held the gun outstretched. I saw the muscles on his hand tense and tighten. I had no time left to decide. Without giving myself another chance to ponder on the possibilities, I shot the entirety of my misty body forwards. By the time I stretched my vapor around the group of children, the man pulled back on his trigger, releasing the chambered bullet within. I barely managed to clear the little ones from its path before it buried into the chest of one of those who had dragged the children from the back of the room. More screams bellowed from all directions, as the large man who had only just discharged his weapon looked on in shock as his associate gripped his padded chest, coughing heavily as he buckled over. He turned to face me as I rounded the corner, carrying the children in the direction of the exit. There were only 2 guards at the twin doors, both of whom turned their weapons towards the dense cloud which was charging right at them. They fired at me, but my reflexes were swift enough to block the bullets from reaching the children I held within my mist. I shot twin tendrils of vapor at the gunmen, solidifying into my taloned fingers when I reached their throats. The little ones screamed in terror as they watched the cavernous, spewing holes appear in the necks of their attackers, but a little psychological trauma was far better than the alternative. When I reached the doors, I set the children softly back onto the floor. Holding on to my intangible form, I allowed one single word for my foggy lips to reach their ears. Run. As soon as they pushed their way through the double doors, and a group of uniformed officers ran towards them, I felt secure in the fact that I had done what I had to, and could now escape this place to avoid any further exposure. That was until the brave little girl stopped in place before turning to face me. "Please," she said, with her lower lip quivering. "Please save my mommy and daddy." Her plea awoke something within me I did not fully understand at first. I had made sure to protect the children, but I had not given a second thought to how any of the adult lives lost could also bring a manner of harm to the little ones. Had my actions been guided by a degree of ignorance? I wondered as I drifted back into the ventilation system in an effort to avoid any further risk of being noticed. Though I gave little care to what harm grown adults saw fit to wage upon one another, I had been blinded to the pain of loss of these innocent lives could wreak. Perhaps my work was not yet done here after all. As I once more took my place high above the wide room in which my fellow hostages were still being held, the glass of the skylight gave way, raining shards of transparent fragments down onto the screaming crowd below. Refusing to allow myself a moment to reconsider, I blew through the grated metal sheet and spread my mist as far across the panicked throng as I could. While I made my efforts to prevent the glass from finding its way into the flesh of any of my previous companions, canisters were launched from above, while men as armored and armed as those who was taken as captive dropped through the opening, swiftly descending the ropes they hung from. As I quickly cleared their path of as many broken shards as I could, I quickly moved to the side to allow them entry, while the canisters they had thrown spat their own man-made fog across the open area. This was good. All of these events had played out over the passage of mere seconds. I could only hope that my own vapor would remain unnoticed, but my chances of remaining unseen had grown exponentially. I soared downwards to allow myself to blend into my new surroundings, while the terrified people on both sides fled from one direction to the next. Gunfire reverberated against the walls of the small shopping center, and those who had only just entered fought against those who held us. While bullets launched in so many uncertain directions, I did what I could to avoid them making contact with any of the innocent who could not escape in time. I could see clearly through the mist which engulfed the room, whilst our captors discharged their weapons in fear. I watched on as many of them fell prey to the well-aimed gunfire of those who had descended from above, wearing advanced eyewear to assist them in locating their targets, all the while making every effort I could to deflect or block the stray bullets from impacting those who did not deserve to die this day. As the fog began to clear, I witnessed our would-be saviors binding the wrists of those who had not fallen over the course of the battle. I found myself somewhat angered by their actions, as they had not taken into account the innocent lives who may have been lost had it not been for my interjection. Regardless of this poorly planned rescue attempt, I felt relieved that this ordeal had finally reached its conclusion. That was until I noticed that not all of those who held us captive were present and accounted for. Most significantly was the absence of the large man who had led this group of filth. I could not see him amongst those with their hands bound behind their backs, nor those who now lay bleeding on the floor. I could only assume that he had made an escape whilst the chaos ensued. This I could not allow. While the group below gathered up their quarry, along with the remaining hostages who had not fled when the attack began, it was clear to me that they had no idea that they allowed some to break free. It would be up to me to track down these men and bring them to justice of my own choosing. With determined purpose, I drifted up through the recently formed hole in the ceiling, exhilarated by the cool night air I had so sorely missed. Down below, to the exterior of the building, I saw the bound men being led outside, while blankets were being handed to the now free hostages. I noticed that the little girl who had stood up to the large man I would now track appeared lost as she weaved in between people in search of her guardians. I felt an anxiousness awaken, as I feared those who may have escaped may have taken little insurance with them. Swiftly, I circled the shopping center's surroundings in search of those who had escaped the authorities, when I perceived an unnatural rustling in the small patch of woods to the rear of the place. Could it be that my vengeance would once more lead me into a forest? I quickly darted into the trees, and towards the sounds of scampering feet. There were shallowed voices and aggravated murmurs. I could hear the pulsing of terrified, quickened heartbeats as I soared quietly overhead to see 3 men leading a female and a male at gunpoint. I did not want to expose my true self to the innocent couple, but I was beginning to see little alternative were I to free them from their abductors. While I attempted to puzzle together a plan, the woods parted to a deserted back alley with large and darkened buildings alongside. While the large man continued to hold his gun on the trembling couple, the small of the trio tinkered with one of the locks of the building's doors. Yes, this would be good. Do proceed inside, my friends. Let us share the darkness together for a time. I quickly searched for my own opening to the warehouse in which my quarry sought entry for. I had to ready myself for their arrival, after all. I swooped in through the crack under the door on the roof, while the others finally crossed through their own chosen entrance. Having maintained my gaseous form for so long, I took a moment to solidify while perching between the rafters of the tall storage area. Boxes upon boxes provided rows of labyrinth-like walls below. I looked on while the group walked single file with torchlight guiding their path. My initial goal would be to separate the captor from the captive, at which time I would be free to allow my presence to be known to those who would only be permitted to see my full form for mere seconds. Once more, I felt the exhilaration cause my scaled and hardened flesh to tingle with anticipation. While I felt my plot form in the recesses of my mind, I knew that those who would feel my wrath this day were true villains. I could not help but wonder if I had indeed acted too harshly against the teenagers who still dwelled behind the walls of a mental institution that their trauma had led them to. Perhaps I will pay them one final visit when my work is done here. Surely they have long since learned the lesson I sought to teach them that night. Having sufficiently rested my weary body, it was time to make my move. Wasting no more time, I dropped from the rafters to topple a tower of highly stacked boxes only feet from the stalking quintet. As the trio of gunmen directed their artificial light in the direction of the calamity I caused, I vaporized one last time, to swoop in and pull the weeping couple away from the ones who would surely not have left them with their lives much longer. I moved so quickly that they did not even have time to react. Naturally, they discharged their weapons in all directions while I soared towards the doorway through which they had gained entry. I left the two trembling and now quite confused individuals by the tree line outside, hopeful that they would recall the path back to the shopping center at which their daughters surely still sought them out. With the first part of my plan having come to fruition, all that remained for me was to have a little fun. When I re-entered the warehouse, the trio was still frantically shouting. I could hear their rapidly beating hearts, and that alone brought me the satisfaction of knowing they were already feeling the fear I relished in. Yes, I could have easily leapt onto them, and torn them limb from limb before they had even the slightest opportunity to react. But why waste a treat so quickly? I could not dally for too much longer, as I expected the authorities would not be far behind after the two I freed reached them. But that didn't mean I couldn't savor it a little while longer. "You should not have come here," I spoke aloud, my deep and guttural words cascading against the walls, echoing them across the room. Again, erratic gunfire erupted, as they could not distinguish from which direction my voice came. "Your firearms will provide you no protection this night." Again, my words were met with the only rebuttal these three knew how to provide. They were becoming quite predictable and incredibly tiresome. Perhaps it was time to pick things up a bit. Fully formed and wings outstretched, I fell from the rafters once more, this time clamping the talons of my feet around the shoulders of the shorter one who had granted these three entry to what was now going to be their tomb. He shrieked in a manner that almost caused my ears to ring, as the other two unleashed their weapons upon me. I hovered above them, allowing their bullets to tear through the flesh of their own companion, while having little effect on mine. As their guns gave the clicking sound that signified that their ammunition was spent, I slowly stretched my legs to each side, while gripping tightly onto the whimpering man's shoulders. His horrified screech amplified when he began to split from where my talons grasped his left shoulder, falling silent once more as he continued to tear apart into two grotesque halves of what was once whole. His fluids poured out onto his comrades, as though a sudden storm had broken out above their heads, as they gave their own shrieking squeals of pure, exhilarating terror. The large man fled, leaving his one remaining associate trembling in place, seemingly unable to move his limbs. He just gazed at me with wide and panicked eyes, and his mouth agape, his friend's blood still trickling down his face, and his voice providing little more than an almost constant whining moan. As the once leader of a now defunct group sped towards the front of the room with his arms flailing, I gave him one final display of what was ahead of him. I gently picked up the terror-filled man beneath me, and, as I had his partner, held him high above the floor. His whimpers gave way to pleas for his life, but alas, he had forfeited his right to live. So, I launched him as hard as my muscled arms were able to, towards the wall above the doorway his ex-leader currently attempted to pull open. The man practically exploded against the hard wall, raining more scarlet liquids across the only one who remained. He fell to his knees as he glared up at me. Though the discarded torches shone their light in no specific direction anymore, there was still enough of a subtle glow for him to truly appreciate the magnitude of what he faced. I wore my unnaturally wide smile, revealing to him every single one of my razor-sharp teeth, glistening in the soft illumination. As we stared at each other, I was momentarily distracted by the sounds of what I assumed to be the law enforcers breaking through the doorway at the rear. By the time I turned my attention back to my prey, he had escaped through the now slayed-open doorway. Before I could receive any unwanted attention, I vaporized once more and fled through the exit below. It took very little time to catch up to the man who had now scampered across the deserted parking lot. With the authorities in pursuit, I had no more time to waste. In one quick movement, I solidified and wrapped my hand around the head of the fleeing man. I flew up high into the night sky, while my victim flailed wildly in my grasp. Once I reached an altitude I was certain nobody from below could perceive, I halted my ascent to gaze into my captive's eyes, one last time. It was your own choices that led you here, I said to the quivering lump of worthless flesh I held high above the world at rest. Please, was the lone word I allowed him to speak before I sank my teeth into his throat. I drank in the glorious liquid before I released my grip, freeing him to descend rapidly to the fate he deserved. Perhaps the public display of the man's body becoming a gelatinous heap of twisted flesh and bone when it would inevitably impact the hard ground below was not the most proficient way to keep my involvement concealed, but I still felt satisfied I had left no evidence of my presence behind. I could have potentially allowed things to play out very differently this night, but I found myself filled with a new and glorious purpose. If I truly wished to live on the surface amongst the people of this world, I would no longer sit idly by and allow such misery to be spread by those with a sinister agenda. I now know that I can save the innocent while keeping my true identity hidden. I was granted these natural talents for a reason, and I finally understand what that means. I would seek to punish the wicked for their deeds, while rescuing those they would wage their foul acts upon. Before I begin my new life's purpose, I will look in on those teenagers one last time. Perhaps I will return to them what I robbed them of that chilly All Hallows Eve that left me an outcast amongst my own, but not this night. Though the outcome of this day's ordeal has left me quite invigorated, it has also rendered me positively exhausted. I believe I have earned some rest through my heroic deeds. Morning will soon come, and though I do not fear the sunrise as those infected by the toxins which run through my veins, I never did care much for it. I will return to my home, and allow my weary bones the glory of well-earned slumber, for tomorrow my life begins anew.